2018. And in this role, he is responsible for promoting the use of corporate and government resources through horizontal and cross-program integrated planning and engineering. Prior to joining aerospace in 2018, Major General Whelan worked at Northrop Grumman as Director of Space Programs, and in that role, he served as the company's primary liaison for high-level customer interface with the Air Force and other U.S. government organizations for coordination of customer engagements and internal and external strategy development. With his depth of knowledge on air and space programs, General Whelan served in a broad range of leadership and management positions across the spectrum of operations, plans, policy, and strategy. General Whelan retired from the Air Force in 2016 after 33 years of service, spanning a range of roles and responsibilities. Please welcome our moderator, Major General Martin Whelan, and the panelists for Panel 4.
Well, thank you, everyone, and I want to thank the Deterrence Symposium and all the work that they've done, and Mike Powell, who worked a lot of the logistics to get these panels going. I really want to thank them. As was stated earlier, this is the 10th symposium. I was at the first one. I finally came back to my second one, so a lot has changed in between, but Pat McVeigh still has white hair, so that hasn't changed. So. As they said in the introduction, I've got a history in the space business. I also worked in the nuclear business as a wing commander up at Minot, North Dakota, and had the opportunity to work as a Deputy 3 in USSTRATCOM for, about 14 months, but it only seems like 3 years. So it was a wonderful opportunity, and had the pleasure of working with many of you. The panel that we have today was asked to address what are the strategies for a multipolar competition. A lot of what we've talked about today has been the great powers, and we reference back to the bipolar world of years gone by, and what are the complexities of the multipolar world. So we want to have a little bit of compare and contrast there. It is the same complexities as the great powers, but it introduces regional actors, and you've heard the references to North Korea and Iran, and there's other regional actors that in a multipolar war you have to take into consideration. It's more complex, it's more diverse, and it's just as difficult to figure out the outcomes. So in a way, you look at the bipolar world that the US and the Soviet Union lived in for many years. Yearning for those days because it was easier is kind of a sad state of affairs, but it was a lot more understandable, and you didn't worry about as many of the variables. Gaining an impact or gaining an influence on one node in a multipolar world creates an equal and opposite effect on another node, and then an unequal and different effect on yet another node. And so understanding those complexities makes this a much more difficult topic to work our way through. To get after the strategies that I introduced, I'm going to introduce the panelists. I'm going to start at the far end, tell you a little bit about the panelists. I'm not going to read their bios because you have them in there. And then we're going to work our way back here, and then we'll open it up for questions. I would encourage you, as questions come up, to text them in or email them. The information is in those books that you have, so you can send those up here and we can get them to the panelists. So our first panelist is Brigadier General Kim Kyu-ha. He is the Deputy Director of Strategic Planning, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the Republic of Korea. General Kim got his education in physics, and somehow through the many years he's become the strategist. And so a great transition within the Korean Army and now the Korean Joint Staff, and he and I had a good opportunity to talk earlier today. I had the pleasure of serving on the peninsula for 2 years, and all I can remember is how good the food was. And so we got into a deep discussion on food. But General Kim, if you could share with us your thoughts.
Okay. Thank you, General Martin. I'm honored to be here and share various insights with you. As you all have different opinions on a wide range of issues, in a similar way, we also have different opinions on multipolar competition. Based on the lens that we use, our strategies may differ. Before starting to suggest my thought, I'd like to ask you a question. Which lens do you use to view multipolar competition? Today, I'd like to suggest that we look at multipolar competition through the lens of peace, because I'm sure we are all seeking for peace here at the 2019 Deterrence Symposium. So I'd like to concentrate our wisdom and knowledge to answer these questions. How are we going to make and build peace? And how are we going to sustain peace? The Korean Peninsula was historically a strategic key location as well as an arena for competition and confrontation among the powerful neighboring countries. The peninsula has always been more vulnerable to conflict than peace. For instance, the Korean War, which was the beginning of the Cold War, marked the climax of the military conflict risk and left Koreans with a deep scar of the divided peninsula. The painful results of the war still remain on the peninsula. After Koreans directly experienced devastation and pain from the war in many aspects, we chose positive peace over waiting for peace to be granted for free. First of all, the Republic of Korea is forming military capability that is able to perform strong deterrence in order to keep the peace we have today. Peace through strength, security that ensures dialogue, can be realized only when you believe peace can be protected and made through strong deterrence. The Korean government is actively implementing its defense reform in all areas of national defense. Furthermore, the government has set aside the largest defense budget in comparison with any successive administration's budget to effectively anchor the reform. In particular, the current government is well aware of the importance of the Fourth Industrial Revolution. Hence, it established the Fourth Industrial Revolution Committee under the direct control of the President, integrating science technology with the national policies. Among them, the Ministry of National Defense is working on defense reform under the theme of smart defense reform. The Republic of Korea has not only one of the best IT infrastructures in the world, but also has outstanding pool of human resources with the highest standards in education, which will be driving forces for defense reform. I strongly believe that integrating IT system with our splendid human resources can accelerate the level of the defense reform. Peace will come when you protect it through strong deterrence and actively exert effort to make peace. The ROC government's national security strategy goal is security that ensures peace. The goal is to build permanent peace regime on the Korean Peninsula, despite the long history of disputes and intense military tension. And in order to build permanent peace, we should not just wait and see how it's going to turn out. Instead, we must actively remove existing and future threats. In other words, we should plan a strategy that proactively reduced threat. In 2017, war clouds gloomed over the Korean Peninsula as North Korea launched missiles and conducted nuclear tests. However, in 2018, the Korean government successfully resolved the growing tension by inviting North Korea to participate in Pyeongchang Olympics holding Inter-Korean Summit and agreeing on the comprehensive military agreement. These developments can be assessed as outcomes of the active efforts to preempt threats in order to build peace. These kind of changes would not have been possible without US President Trump's decision and willful actions. In particular, The comprehensive military agreement, which was signed on September 19th of 2018, is not only contributing to sustaining the current armistice status, but also in easing the military tensions and building mutual trust. Both sides agreed to cease all hostile acts toward each other, withdraw all guard posts within the demilitarized zone, establish a maritime peace zone, and conduct joint remains recovery project. Of course, it is impossible to build and bring permanent peace without North Korea's complete denuclearization. The ROC and US are closely coordinating in order to bring North Korea to track of complete denuclearization. As you know, yesterday, North Korea fired another 2 short-range ballistic missiles. The Republic of Korea government voices deep concerns over North Korea's recent missile launches. But our National Security Council members decided to continue diplomatic efforts to prevent losing the momentum for resumption of negotiations for the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula that was created by the historic meeting at Panmunjom area. North Korea must not miss the golden opportunity. Meanwhile, the international community should also continue to show its interests and efforts to completely dismantle North Korea's nuclear weapons. As we work together for the complete denuclearization, building strong military trust between the 2 Koreas will accelerate peace process on the peninsula. The international community's support and cooperation are crucial in building and sustaining peace on the peninsula. International relations are closely and mutually entangled in terms of politics, economy, security, and many other aspects. Military tensions and crises in one area often directly or indirectly affect stability in other areas. So one nation's crisis is not only one nation's problem, but also world's problem. Thus, the existence of allies and partnerships that share democratic values and rule-based order will not only play a vital role for our nation's security, but also for regional stability. The former U.S. Secretary of Defense, James Mattis, I admire, emphasized the importance of alliance in terms of national security. He simply said that nations with allies thrived, while the others without allies did not survive in history. Engagement and cooperations with allies that share values, visions, awareness of threats, and establishment of combined defense posture will reduce threats, ultimately forming cornerstones for peace building. Lastly, I'm confident that this year's Deterrence Symposium will immensely contribute to the robustness of the alliance's coordination and leadership. Thank you.
Thank you, General Kim. Our next panelist has a different view. If you see the world that General Kim works in and has a really strong regional aspect, we're asking Brigadier General John Nichols to take on this global view. He is the Deputy Director for Nuclear Operations, Global Operations at U.S. Strategic Command. Prior to this job that he's been in for a couple of months, he was the commander of the 509th Bomb Wing at Whiteman Air Force Base in Missouri. He has flying experience in the B-1, the B-2, and introduced MQ-9 to the mix at his previous assignments. So he's got a depth of experience. One of the things I do know is he's got a really hard job, because I spent 6 weeks being the J3N at STRATCOM. I screwed it up royally, and they're still trying to fix it. So I do know that you've got at least 10 years here before you can get everything fixed. So John, your opening comments, please.
Well, thank you, General Whelan. Appreciate you moderating today's panel. I appreciate the opportunity to be here today and to offer my perspective. One of the big themes that's come out over the past day and a half has been about the importance of allies and partners as we work to advance our collective interests across the globe. So I'd just like to say in advance to all the panelists here today, Thank you for your perspectives, especially those from the Indo-PACOM region. We've been talking a little bit about great power competition, and we certainly had that during the Cold War. During that period, there was a limited number of deterrence variables, if you will, that were at play at any one time, because as the United States, we were focused primarily on one threat country, that being the Soviet Union. But we no longer live in that bipolar world, a world from a deterrence perspective, which was simply a much easier problem. Now our concern is multiple actors with a range of capabilities available to them across the earth. This forces us, as General Kim just mentioned, to look at deterrence through a new lens with questions that we need to ask ourselves, such as how do we deter multiple adversaries, sometimes at the same time? How do we work deterrence across multiple regions around the globe? And how do we work through multiple domains? So one size certainly does not fit all anymore. We need a tailored approach with flexible capabilities. And this is really a whole host of things. It's a broad assortment of tools in the toolkit, mix of nuclear loads on our weapons, yields, modernized platforms, et cetera, to deter against a very wide spectrum. So what deters one actor on the world stage today necessarily may not deter another. So the bottom line for me is deterrence in the 21st century requires the integration of all of our capabilities across all of the domains and across any boundaries that we may see as we progress as a joint force and as an allied and coalition force. Nuclear deterrence is foundational part of our overall deterrence posture. And this was said a lot yesterday, but I think it's worth reinforcing today. That is really, it's a whole of government approach to everything we do. And it involves all of the instruments of power. All the instruments of power that we can bring to bear as a nation, both in the United States and with our partner nations. Dr. Kissinger famously wrote, and I'll quote, "Deterrence requires the combination of power, the will to use it, and the assessment of these by the potential aggressor. If any one of them is zero, then deterrence fails." The #1 mission in U.S. Strategic Command is strategic deterrence. And they really, we've heard the leadership of STRATCOM talk about this in a very similar way to the way Dr. Kissinger did. The parts of that equation are capability. We've got to have the capabilities necessary to impose costs or deny benefit with anyone that seeks to take action in the world order. The second part of that equation is credibility. We have to fundamentally be effective, and we have to be credible. We have to test and evaluate all of our systems, warheads, the enterprise, and the people that make it all happen. And with regards to, we need to make sure that our credibility with regards to our willingness to use them is completely understood. And that leads into the third piece, that being the communication. An adversary must know that we have the capabilities, the credibility, and we must clearly message that intent. And it can't just be a broad message. In many cases, it has to be a very specific, nuanced message to the individual that controls the key to the nuclear, the keys to that nuclear capability in an adversary country. If any one of those factors falls below an acceptable level, you risk failure in your strategic deterrence mission. If we allow malign activity to occur without any meaningful cost imposition, we won't and we cannot deter an adversary because we will be unable to change their behavior in many respects. I look forward to perhaps discussing and digging into this in the case of cyberspace and some of the discussions that came up in that domain yesterday. So let me conclude my opening comments by saying that one other important point of aspect of deterrence is to effectively deter, you have to be able to characterize and attribute the threat that is coming in your direction. So when we look at the advancement of things such as advanced cruise missiles and some of the hypersonic and hypersonic glide vehicles that are out there today and some of the asymmetric threats that exist in the world order, this certainly is a challenge to our ability to detect and characterize. I look forward to discussing some of those issues as we continue down the panel. So thank you.
Thank you, General Nichols. Our next panelist is Dr. Melanie Hart. As you can see, she's not one of the uniform-wearing members of the panel, but that doesn't change the depth that she has paid to the issues that we're discussing here on both deterrence and really China. She has a long history of studying how the Chinese think and how the Chinese approach problems, first as from a commercial world, working with Qualcomm. She's currently the Senior Fellow and Director of the China Policy at the Center for American Progress. So she's taking this, this deep thinking and trying to help educate and help us learn how we should approach these issues. I noted, earlier today we heard from General Ray, and he talked about all the reading he's done. I'm not nearly the reader he is, but even more, I'm not sure I've read as much as you've written on China. So I know my limit. So you're very well published in this topic, and we look forward to hearing your thoughts from the China view and also how we may have some misconceptions.
Great, thank you. And thanks for the opportunity to be here to represent the beyond military domain in multipolar competition. Earlier today at the lunch discussion, General Ray stated that we need to think about our adversary's theory of victory, figure out what gives us unbeatable advantages, and protect that, because that is what our adversaries are targeting. So I'm going to talk about multipolar competition, specifically with China, from that angle. We have two key strategic advantages that, from a Chinese perspective, create deep fear and insecurity about the way it makes it difficult for China to achieve some of its goals vis-a-vis the United States. One is our economic and technical superiority. The second is, as others have mentioned, the global system, which is primarily based on institutions that the United States founded and on liberal democratic values and standards. China is currently working extraordinarily actively in both of those domains to shift the advantage from the United States to China. In the economic domain, China is using its integration in the global economy, its business relationships with the United States, its investment projects in other countries to siphon off U.S. technical advantages bit by bit and strengthen its own economy at our expense, and to create dependencies that Beijing can use to conduct economic coercion and push other nations into following its diplomatic and political objectives. In the global system realm, China is working to transform or reform the current global governance system, the current global order, from one based on liberal democratic values and standards to one that supports a more authoritarian vision, authoritarian values and standards. The Chinese Communist Party is very clear about this. Chinese leaders state that we need more diversity, and diversity means more authoritarianism. China is obsessed with those two goals because those are the two things that are China's biggest disadvantages. So as General Ray suggested earlier today, we need to be putting all of our focus on keeping those advantages on our side and exploiting any weaknesses that they might give any potential adversaries. Unfortunately, my personal view is that currently the United States is doing exactly the opposite. It's walking away from some of our advantages and giving China in particular room to reshape the playing field in its favor. Instead, I would like to see the United States focusing on some of the weaknesses that give us an advantage. They are on the Chinese weaknesses that we should be paying more attention to. First is that China is utterly dependent on global economic integration to survive economically and keep moving up the development ladder. The Chinese Communist Party is unwilling to make the domestic political reforms that they would need to be able to complete their innovation cycles at home, so they have to borrow, steal, siphon off technologies from abroad. So economic integration is as much a dependency for China as it is a lever of coercion. Secondly, China cannot meet global liberal democratic values and standards. They will not meet them at home. Their people know that. The leadership know that. That's why a system based on those values and standards is a deep threat. If you cannot survive economically without integration, and you're integrating into a system that you cannot live up to, then that creates a problem and a big risk, and that's why they're so obsessed with systematic change. Third, China's great diplomatic success that we're seeing right now utterly depends on their ability to control information and control the narrative. Look at Belt and Road projects. The interest rates are not public because they are disastrously high. The interest rates for some of the projects in Sri Lanka were 6.5, 7%. The average World Bank interest rate is less than 1%. When you put all of the information out there, then suddenly the story that China is selling in the world is much less powerful. So I would like to see the United States leveraging our advantages and some of China's weaknesses by doing 5 big things that could completely revolutionize the non-military domain that we're fighting in and existing in when it comes to multipolar competition. The first is that we have to be strong at home. We have to make the right investments at home. The lesson I take away from the Cold War and the decades that followed is that as a nation, we are not capable of getting domestic policy right without a peer competitor. When we weren't facing off against the Soviet Union, we didn't invest in R&D, we didn't invest in education, we didn't invest in infrastructure. So in a way, China is a gift. We have a peer competitor now, and we can actually make the investments that can put the United States in a strong position and reduce some of the anxieties that we feel about China. That should cover everything from creating education opportunities for everyone across all parts of America to making our own 5G technology and investing in our own secure 5G infrastructure so that we have an alternative to what Huawei's building and can potentially offer that alternative to allies and partners as well. Secondly, we should force China to choose between economic integration with the global system and the path that it's on domestically with its current economic program. We have the tools to do that. We could, for example, work with our allies and partners to file a nullification and impairment case against China at the WTO. If we won, China would be either thrown out of the WTO or it would have to address all of the economic complaints that we have about China. If we're in that situation, I can guarantee you some of the concerns you have about PLA spending and activities would be, in Beijing at least, surpassed by some much bigger economic survival concerns. If we were to lose that case, then we would have demonstrated to all of our allies and partners that our current trading system cannot deal with our biggest economic challenge, and we need something new, maybe something that puts China in a more periphery position. Third, I'd like to see the United States form a digital trade agreement with allies and partners, Five Eyes nations, and other like-minded countries that want and are willing to abide by high standard transparency and accountability policies so that we can have great trade with Australia, great trade with the Republic of Korea, with Japan, and other nations that don't bring the same concerns as, say, a Huawei device. That way our companies aren't being shut off unilaterally, but rather given a new rich market to explore that creates security instead of undermining it. Fourth, I'd like to see the U.S. do a very strong, positive push for a global governance vision that offers a counterpoint to China. Right now, China is actively reforming the global governance system. We are actively backing out of it and withdrawing from institutions. That is ceding one of our biggest advantages. We should instead be advocating a positive vision and forcing China to declare what exactly it is that their vision is, so that other nations can make a clear-eyed choice between which path they want. And fifth and finally, I'd like to see the United States working regionally on the Belt and Road Initiative, working with ASEAN, for example, so that we can help ASEAN develop transparency platforms where any incoming nation-state investor has to publish all of the details of their development projects so that the local people can make some decisions about whether that project is a good or bad option for their country. If you have China putting forward that they have a very low-tech project with a 7% interest that doesn't meet global standards, if that information is out there, maybe we can get some US companies in, Japanese companies, South Korean, Australian companies in with alternatives and shift the balance of what's happening economically. Earlier today, someone asked the question, where should the US not compete? And in some aspects of the Belt and Road Initiative, I think one thing our national security strategy gets totally wrong right now is that the current NSS suggests that anywhere that China's investing, that is a zero-sum situation that we need to try to counter or block. In reality, if China wants to build a road in Africa, and it's based on market interest rates, and it's based on decent standards, that is not going to undermine U.S. national security. If we have transparency in standards, that can eliminate some of our concerns with these projects and free up U.S. resources to focus on other areas of concern.
Thank you, Dr. Hart. You gave us a lot to think about there, and I appreciate your linkage back to the entanglement, some of the comments made in that panel in yours. I can honestly say it's the first time at a deterrence symposium I've ever heard the statement, China is a gift. So I had to write that one down. And there's no better way to segue than we also got a gift from Australia. Major General Gavin Reynolds is currently the head of military strategic plans in the Office of the Vice Chief of the Defense Force in Australia. Gav has worked with the United States and other allies in a number of operations around the world, to include the Gulf War and Afghanistan. You did UN operations in Lebanon and Syria, and have seen the world from a lot of different perspectives. He did list a lot of his hobbies to include, he enjoys military history, rugby, cycling, and running. And I thought, that's good for a strategist, because you should think about the past and learn from those lessons, spend a whole lot of energy, and then when that doesn't work, just throw some muscle at it to solve your problem. So we look forward to your comments, and then we can open up to the audience for questions.
Thank you, Marty. Good afternoon. I'm not sure if you've seen the movie Crocodile Dundee. So in the movie, the actor Paul Hogan, who plays Dundee, is visiting the city of New York, and a thief comes up to him with a knife and says, "Give me your wallet." Well, Dundee pulls out a knife which is twice the size of the thief and says, "Mate, that's not a knife, this is a knife." And if only deterrence was that simple. But this afternoon, what I want to do is have a discussion with you about conventional deterrence. And firstly, we must accept that the geostrategic context has changed, and that the role of deterrence has changed. Since the Second World War, we tended to think of deterrence in terms of nuclear weapons, and I think that theme has come up a couple of times during the panels throughout the day. Well, we still have nuclear weapons. However, since the end of the Cold War, there's been a fundamental shift, and this has been through the emergence of threats and indeed attacks on the liberal, rules-based order in multiple domains within the zone of competition below violent conflict, the grey zone. And this is in addition to the proliferation of long-range missiles. So what strategies are required for deterrence in this new world of competition? I'll restrict my remaining 3 minutes to 4 elements of a strategy around conventional deterrence. The first element is national resilience, the capacity for the nation state to deal with the attacks in cyberspace, on our democratic institutions, and through economic coercion. In Australia, over the last 18 months, we've increased the capacity of our cyber defences. We've made security-based decisions on foreign participation and investment in our communications infrastructure. We've introduced counter foreign interference laws. We've brought greater transparency to political donations, and I think most importantly, we have a more mature dialogue with the Australian people about the threats that our nation faces. The next element is retaining or gaining a comparative advantage in new technologies, as I do believe this is fundamental to achieving deterrence in multi-domain competition. And this does include hypersonics, directed energy weapons, artificial intelligence, and autonomous systems. But better still, we need to do this with our tech-savvy allies. But there is a problem. Technology is outpacing our operating concepts. And for me, the way that we assess the military balance and the linear approach to the escalation ladder are no longer fit for our times. We need a different model where the response to an action or an attack can be in any domain. And it doesn't need to be an eye for an eye. It could be a leg for an eye or a nose or any other body part. In fact, it doesn't need to be proportional, but it does need to be appropriate, and it does need to be in concert with our values. Finally, alliances and partnerships remain extremely valuable in an era of multipolar competition. What does need to change is the posture of those networks and partnerships. Rather than being structured for assurance, by changing the posture to a warfighting orientation, we can enable deterrence. If we adopt these elements of a strategy, we can shape a more effective approach to deter actions that are eroding the rules-based order.
Thanks, Gab. Appreciate the thoughts there. I'm going to get after a couple of the questions that we had talked about before, but there's one that came in that's more of a current event, so I wanted to look to my international partners first. The North Koreans, as General Kim pointed out, launched missiles just the other day, and they've continued to launch missiles. And there's been some open press reports that there was use of Russian technology in the North Korean missiles. We also know that the Russians and the Chinese have flown on your eastern and western coasts in Korea, and they've flown out, got very up close and personal to Australia. How does this more provocative act affect the relationship of the Republic of Korea to Russia and China and Australia to Russia and China? And I'll start with General Kim first.
Yeah, actually, North Korea provocations like fires of SRBM is a very serious threat to South Korea. And especially, like I mentioned, Moderator, North Korea technology would be used by Russian missile technology, Iskander. Now that it is a very serious problem, we think North Korea's clear intentions to provocative actions. First, I think in order to overcome weakness in conventional forces, North Korea is strengthening missile capabilities. North Korea is also strengthening asymmetrical capabilities such as short-range missiles and the regime survival. And North Korea traditionally has perceived Iraq and US combined exercise as a serious threat. That's why North Korea would be cooperative with Russia and China. And actually, these North Korea's visible actions like firing short-range missiles, it would be trying to strengthen the unity of the military and people under the indirect and direct support by Russia and China. And by firing short-range missiles rather than intercontinental ballistic missiles, which the United States perceive as a red line, North Korea is trying to maintain negotiation momentum and gain advantage at the same time. In other words, it would be aimed at increasing pressure on the United States ahead of the possible resumption of nuclear talks with Washington. But I think it would reflect North Korea's anxiety on internal situation. And North Korea is suffering from economic hardship due to sanctions and pressures. Due to increasing discontent of North Koreans, Kim Jong-un may be desperate to lift the sanctions and make progress in negotiation as soon as possible. But China is Russian, as I said earlier, strongly support North Korea's position. And that's why it would be a very big challenge when it comes to refreshing sanctions against North Korea. Yeah, thank you.
Gav?
I'll offer a slightly different perspective. So last week we wrapped up the one of the largest exercises that are conducted globally, and that's exercise Talisman Sabre, which was held off the Queensland coast, and it's an interoperability exercise between the United States and Australia. It had 34,000 people, and it was absolutely fantastic, extremely well done. And Japan also participated in that exercise. Well, during the exercise, China had a spy ship which came down and sat off the Queensland coast. I don't mind that. First of all, we knew exactly where they were at all times, but most importantly, they got to see the fact that we have fantastic interoperability, that we have the capability within our alliance to do what we need to do if our governments decide that they need the military for a whole-of-government approach. And that is one of the fundamentals of deterrence.
Thanks, Gav. So this next question I know didn't come from Admiral Brooks because it refers to non-strategic nuclear weapons. But it's aimed first at General Nichols, and you talked about deterrence. And so should a multipolar world drive towards more diverse options, including broader range of nuclear options to include different nuclear use of nuclear weapons? And how do you bring that into that equation you raised about deterrence?
Right. So let me start with this fundamental premise, and I think it will largely be agreed upon. And if it's not, please shout out. But I think this comes back to, at least for the United States, where the strength that we gained from the nuclear strategic triad. You know, it was, I think, now 12 presidential administrations that, despite some angst and some opposition, have come back to this construct in terms of what we do as a United States in terms of our three pillars. It's a very sound strategy in terms of our bombers. They're flexible, as you know. We can recall, we can signal with them, we can push them around the globe pretty easily. Our nuclear attack submarines are the most secretive part in terms of being unknown, in terms of location, position, and are able to survive. And then the intercontinental ballistic missiles are going to be your most ready aspect. So that fundamental triad is important, but that triad, as we know, is getting old. And it needs to be modernized. So to get at the question, I think this is a big part of what we are attempting to do, is we need to bring our triad up to current day standards. So we've got major acquisition programs, as General Ray talked about, with in many cases very little to zero margin left in those programs. Whether you're talking about ground-based strategic deterrent, whether you're talking about the new B-21 bomber, or whether you're talking about an LRSO missile that replaced our outcome on the B-52. Those are important aspects of what we're trying to do, is to modernize so that we remain an effective deterrent force. But with that modernization, I think we've come to the realization, as we look in some of the gaps and seams that exist out there today with an adversary nation, if we are able or unwilling to impose a cost to an adversary action, so take a Russia with a smaller nuclear weapon, a low-yield option that is exercised or executed in a very narrow and given situation. If our adversary perceives that we have no ability to respond to that, other than going large, if you will, for a very prompt response, then there may be a capability gap in there. So when we look at things that we are putting and modernizing our weapon systems with new tools, if you will, in the toolkit, things such as a low-yield sea-launched ballistic missile off of our nuclear submarines, that is an opportunity to fill a space and a gap that will hopefully deter any adversary from taking an option, because we have only one way to go with that. Now, to be fair, and for the audience, since this is being live streamed, the United States does possess low-yield nuclear options. The issue is that they're all air-delivered. So it's not a prompt response. It takes hours, if you will, to get those platforms to deliver that effect in the battle space. So I think the answer to the question is we need to continue to modernize to make sure that we remain a viable deterrent in the world order, and we need to continue to look at where those capability gaps exist and to plug those gaps to the max extent possible so that our adversaries never perceive a weakness in any of those domains.
Thanks, sir. Let me turn that to Dr. Hart. How are the Chinese going to look at this? You know, as it was laid out by the general, you know, it seems a sound approach, but is that going to be alarming or understood properly by the Chinese as we modernize and look at additional options?
You know, any increase in U.S. capability, someone earlier mentioned that Russia makes everything about them and assumes that anywhere something happens in the world, it must be the U.S. behind it targeting Russia. So from China's perspective, you know, they're going to have a really hard time accepting that increases in U.S. capabilities aren't specifically targeted at China in some way. However, I think there are ways to be clear in the messaging. And I hope that General Kim will correct me if I'm wrong, but I have heard from some friends in South Korea that some of China's complaints about the missile defense system reduced once they were taken to see the system exactly where it was and some of the geographical limitations for how it could be used for some of their concerns about how it could be used to target China. It sounded to me that with some transparency about the specific purpose of the system, that it enabled South Korea to address some of the triggering concerns on the Chinese side. So one challenge for the United States is to figure out how can you increase your deterrence capabilities while also increasing your targeted communication so that you don't trigger the kind of conflict that those capabilities are aimed at avoiding.
Okay. Thank you. A question from the audience was, we'll start with Dr. Hart, but we'll also look for the international feedback on that, is the current economic tariffs against China effective? If not, what else can we do economically? And want to look at it more also from a regional perspective, so I'll be asking our international partners to comment as well. But Dr. Hart, if you'll give us your thoughts.
Sure. So the tariffs have had one benefit. The one benefit is that they have forced U.S. companies to take a clear-eyed assessment of the risks that they face in their deep exposure in the Chinese market. Many CEOs just weren't having that conversation with their boards about what risks they faced with potential IPR theft, the fact that Chinese regulations were eventually going to throw them out, how their exposure to China was making money today but risking killing off their business 2, 3, 5, 10 years down the road. Those conversations weren't happening. Now those conversations are forced to happen because everyone recognizes that they're having this tariff impact. However, in terms of broader, medium, longer-term strategy with China, they are not effective at all. Because what the tariffs actually do, there's two problems with them. First of all, some of the strategic response ideas that I mentioned, one theme running throughout them is they all require us to work collaboratively with allies and partners because we have a united front with other countries on our concerns about China, and we fight together alone. We fight stronger together than we do alone. And unfortunately, the tariff strategy is firing off at the allies and partners as much as firing off against China. And so that is dividing our common front instead of unifying it. The second problem is that the tariff strategy basically just isolates U.S. companies. It tells U.S. companies, no, you don't have as much benefit, as much access to the China market as you did before, but what do you do now? Instead, what I would like to see is a strategies that are a pulling effect from China, saying instead of dependence on China, you do this other thing, which has to be deeper integration and trading and investment relationships with other countries that are willing to play by these fair rules and standards. And that's why I suggest I would much rather see joint approaches with the WTO, a digital trade agreement. We're creating deep commercial opportunity for the United States elsewhere, not just restricting some of the things that we can do with China. Because if we're the only ones closing the door, there are a lot of other doors around the world. China just pivots to Europe, pivots to other parts of Asia. They'll get the same thing elsewhere. We'll just take an economic hit on the sidelines.
Thank you. Gab, do you have any thoughts on the tariffs from your country's perspective or your personal perspective?
I'm a soldier.
Danger.
Clearly, a trade conflict between the world's largest economies has an impact on everyone. We look forward to a resolution of that conflict within the rules and the standards. And I think it's also important that there is action taken to prevent the theft of intellectual property. So if all of those things can be resolved, then we're certainly an advocate for that occurring. That is the resolution.
Thank you. General Kim, from your perspective.
Actually, from a historical point of view, close geographical location of the Korean Peninsula to China contributed to the flow of various types of influence from China into the peninsula. And realistically, the ROC, just like the East Asian nations, maintains close economic relations with China. A deployment of USFK's THAAD missile systems in 2016, like mentioned Dr. Hart, brought significant consequences to the economy and sentiment of the people in our country, and it is not yet fully recovered. Although it is clear that there are no other priorities that can replace the US and ROC alliance for the national security of the Republic of Korea, it is also true. But that the influence of China of the economy of Republic of Korea cannot be taken lightly. And China is the fastest growing economy in East Asia, and it is necessary for ROC to maintain a cooperative relationship with China in regards in areas such as an economy.
Thank you. I'm going to exercise the moderator prerogative here and kind of segue back to something that General Ray raised in his talk today about, he looked around and saw some of the industry partners here and talked about the role industry plays in the United States. And as I was listening to him talk and thinking about the multipolar competition, what role does industry, and I probably want to focus down more on the commercial industry play in helping from both a deterrence but also from a stability level in the international politique. Do we use our commercial entities as a instrument of power to help us with both deterrence and for stability? And I'll kind of open that up for anyone who has any thoughts for use of the commercial world.
I'll just maybe kick it off with we're absolutely reliant on the commercial world because they are the industries, they are the giants that produce these awesome weapon systems of our nation and our allies. I think the thing, and I said this when I was up at Whiteman Air Force Base visiting some of the aerospace partners, and this would come up a lot. What's very concerning to me, and I think concerning to many in this room, is the intellectual theft that's happening right under our noses. So in terms of how we get our arms around ensuring that China doesn't get free stuff, we do all the work and they're able to enter the development game and the production game in the bottom of the seventh inning instead of playing the entire game. I think that is very, very disturbing. It's scary, the amount of stuff that's happening, and I think we need to lock it down. Easier said than done, but I think that gets kind of into the cyber realm in terms of cyber defense teams, and industry certainly has a role in making sure that their intellectual property is safe and secure and not given away for free. So I'll just kick it off with that.
I know it's far afield from the military world, but didn't know if either of you have a comment, or Dr. Hart, if you have a thought on how we could use commercial world as part of our economic power.
Well, I think it's a very good point that John has made in relation to supporting the commercial world and industry so that they are aware of the threats which exist in this multipolar world, and that we support them. So it's not just a matter of identifying what those threats are, but providing them with the tools and ensuring that there is a cyber defence posture for the nation. I think that's extremely important. It does depend on scale as far as the capacity for commerce or your commercial structures to support your national goals. That can absolutely be a part of it, and that can be a wonderful force for good, as long as the industry, the commercial entities, can be convinced that it's in their interest to do so. And of course, there'll always be competing tensions.
Just to offer a counterpoint, you know, I'm very concerned about not just the technology theft, but the amount of technology that U.S. corporations are voluntarily handing over to China for corporate gain. You know, a lot of people are talking about Huawei's 5G technology. Well, you know, in the 2G era, China didn't have any technology option. They bootstrapped themselves up basically by stitching together foreign technology components, which they obtained by licensing them from American companies and European companies. So there's a lot in the semiconductor sector right now. You know, China, one of China's big weaknesses is that they can't make semiconductors. So they export computers, servers, phones, all of these electronic components all over the world, but they actually can't make the chips that those components, those devices depend on. So 95% of the chips that are in anything that goes exported out of China are sourced overseas. They're frantically trying to acquire that technology by buying up pieces of the US semiconductor value chain. And that's happening right now. So companies will voluntarily sell themselves and their technology to China for profit. So my biggest concern is really, what will American companies give up to China for profit, and how can our system stem that tide without inhibiting the market, the commercial market capitalism that makes us strong? The U.S. Congress has taken some baby steps toward figuring that out, but it is very much in its infancy right now. So I currently see more risk than reward when it comes to the U.S.-China relationship. However, and when it comes to the U.S. businesses operating globally in other places, that gives us, of course, some great partnership and great leverage, if you will.
Okay, thank you. So Gab, this is a pointed question to you about a comment that you had raised. Can you elaborate on the strategy of shifting from assurance to a warfighting posture to deter gray zone actions? How do you see that being done?
It really comes down to pre-positioning. So where you see those threats as emanating from, and ensuring that you are managing your forces to be in the right place at the right point in time. If you speak about things like the speed of relevance and being in the right place, when you look at the Indo-Pacific, over the years there has been a shifting of the sands as far as where the alliance has allocated people and where we've allocated our capabilities, and I do believe the time is ripe to have a review of that and determine where we need to pre-position our forces, what sort of capabilities we need to have in particular locations throughout the Indian Ocean, Southeast Asia, the South China Sea, and into the Pacific Ocean. So that's what I'm talking about. It's where we pre-position our forces and ensuring that we have the right concept of operation, so we have the right forces in place, and then we can buy the time to reinforce as we need to, depending on the contingency that we face.
Okay. Yeah, John?
One of the statements that was made in the classified piece yesterday was a statement that I thought was really thought-provoking, and that statement was, deterrence has failed in cyberspace. Pretty bold statement, and you know, there's a lot of actors, there's a lot of agencies. U.S. Cyber Command is doing some amazing things to battle in that domain, but as we look at this gray space competition, I tend personally to agree with the proposition that we are not doing everything that we can in the cyber domain. And I think in terms of the question that you asked General Reynolds is where we can do a better job about competing. If we are unwilling, or as a nation state, as allied and partners in this fight to impose costs on the adversary, I think we've got very little hope in changing an adversary's behavior. So I think part of the challenge is that the cyber domain is new. It's a little uncomfortable. It's squishy. You know, it's like flying airplanes, powered flight in 1903. We didn't understand it. We didn't know exactly what it would become, but we got airborne and we figured out along the way. Now there's an entire system, aerospace system, nationally and internationally with accepted norms of behavior. And I think we perhaps need to view cyber domain in that realm as we don't understand it, but we need to dip our toe into it. And I know we are in many respects, but I don't think, I mean, we need to go into it eyes wide open. We don't need to upset the balance, but I think we need to compete a little bit harder in that realm. And you can probably add space to that bucket. So just one thing to offer, and I thought it was a great thought-provoking statement made yesterday.
So let me ask you, though, down those realms, because you opened that can of worms there, do we need to deter in cyberspace? Do we need to deter in space, or do we need to deter and use all domains? I think, Gav, in your comments, you kind of raised that, and John, in our discussions, we talked about the need for deterrence, not so much deterrence within a domain. Your thoughts on that, John?
I would agree with you fundamentally that deterrence is a broad statement and strategy and thought, and you look at it in many different ways, but to say that we cannot deter, we need to talk about deterrence absent of the domains, I don't think is fair either. I think we need to talk about how we deter across in each of those domains and across any geographical boundary that we may have between combatant commanders, et cetera, between nations, partners. So I think deterrence absolutely is the umbrella term, but in overall deterrence, it's a nuanced type of a thing. And I think we need to be able to have the discussion of how we do it in the cyber domain, because if we do not change behavior, then that leads you to the cost proposition of, are we okay with the state of affairs? Are we going to fight back in that domain or not? And maybe the answer is we don't, for a host of reasons. Maybe we defend to the best of our capability, but our offensive actions are limited. I'm not sure the exact correct balance, but I would offer, back to your initial question, I think you have to talk about things, not deterrence in cyber absent of all other deterrence aspects, but I think you need to be able to talk about aspects within each domain.
Okay. Gav, did you want to add to that?
I just believe it's really important to make yourself a hard target and to have redundancy and resilience in your systems. So you have to ensure, for example, we rely heavily on precision navigation and timing from the GPS satellite systems. What we need to do is to ensure that we have the capacity, if we lose access to those systems, that our military capability, or indeed our societies, don't fall apart. And that's important, because then your potential adversary will look at the costs of conducting a certain activity And if you have the resilience to deal with that attack or action, then perhaps it will shift their risk calculus, and they may not conduct that particular action because it's not going to have the effect that they're looking for. And that's fundamentally important. Having some way of influencing their risk calculus and making them think about that second and third order effect and whether the cost is worth it, whether there's any benefit from it, is fundamentally important.
Okay. General Kim.
Yeah, on the multipolar competition, we have to deal with fast changes in politics, economy, society, and military. Especially military capability is changing so quickly that it is difficult to predict the range of the development because of the fourth industrial revolution technologies. If we cannot respond to the change of the military capability, strategic competitors may miscalculate the balance of power by overestimating their own capabilities like cyber threat, cyber capability, and underestimating competitors' capabilities. Strategic competitors may miscalculate the balance of power by overestimating their own capabilities. And in the end, the miscalculation may get in the way of deterrence, which restrains aggressive actions such as or the use of force in the decision-making process.
Thank you, sir. This next question comes from the audience, and this panel has been China-focused, and earlier panels have had a little bit more slant towards the Russian involvement. And the question was for Dr. Hart, but anyone can jump in and share this. Is there a threat of a Sino-Russian cooperation in the current strategic environment? Do we need to think about them coming together and becoming a much more complex problem?
In some ways, so China and Russia share a common world view, which is that the current international system was designed and built by the US for its own benefit, and that shifting toward a more authoritarian system will benefit China and Russia and disadvantage us. So we do see them working collaboratively in different venues to reshape the system together. So one would be within the UN, China and Russia have jointly worked to block the effort to form some joint common norms on a free and open global internet, because neither China nor Russia wants the internet to be free and open. They prefer the authoritarian sovereign state locked down version. So they work collaboratively in that venue to block that, and they work collaboratively in other venues separately. So I'm more concerned with how they work at a global norms and systems level than I am with how they work collaboratively economically. If you look at individual Sino-Russian economic deals, with the gas pipeline, China's really taking advantage of Russia on that one and getting a really good deal. There tends to be more of a winner or loser when you get outside of that global governance space.
Okay. So John, not that you've been here for a few months and you got everything solved here at STRATCOM, how would something like a Sino-Russian coming together add some complexity to the role that you and the full team here at STRATCOM have to address?
I think simply it adds a lot of complexity to it. I think we need to monitor and stay eyes wide open for any hint that that's occurring, because that can be problematic from a number of different levels. There's a geographic piece to this. There is a diplomatic piece to this. There's certainly a military piece to this. And that's one heck of an alliance and partnership if they can pull that off. So, just at the very base, we need to be eyes wide open for any signs that this may be occurring. And I think the counter to that is we continue to grow and strengthen our alliances and our partnerships around the globe. And I really do believe that is the way forward when you look at the next 10, 20 years in terms of influence, because a lot to me of what China and Russia stand for just at a fundamental level, is absolutely against our Western societies and what we stand for as nations and countries, and what we believe as a people fundamentally in terms of democracies and freedoms that we enjoy. And I think we shine a big light at every opportunity to what these countries are doing, whether it's extractive economic policies across the globe, whether it's malign influence in any domain. We have to be able to speak the truth, get this truth out there, help our industries and corporations understand what's happening underneath their own nose if they don't already know that, help provide the tools to that. So, you know, as they build alliances, and up to this point they've been relatively unsuccessful in doing such, we need to make sure that we always are eyes wide open to that big joining of those two, and then continue to build our own partnerships around the globe.
Okay, thank you. We have time for, it looks like, one, maybe two more questions. So I'm going to reach back to one of the earlier panels and also tie it into the multipolar world here. So it was the panel that included Mr. Stolworthy, Mr. Cordesman, and Admiral Brooks. They talked about great powers compete. I think he said great powers compete. That's what they do. And then they talked about arms control regimes and how they offer transparency, stability, and they warned about problems with verification and compliance. But they didn't talk about it in a multipolar world. So as we talked about multipolar competitions, what is the value and what are risks of arms control regimes in a multipolar world? Can we figure it out? Let me pick on any one of you. Gav, you're sitting next to me. You were trying to tie your shoes, but I saw you.
It's interesting, isn't it? When you look at things like New Start and the INF. So, I mean, that was a relationship between the United States and Russia. But we have a number of other nuclear-armed nations in the world, and particularly China. So surely if you look to re-engage on intermediate-range nuclear missiles, or if you want to re-engage on a New Start type of treaty, then a nation that has hundreds of nuclear missiles, surely shouldn't they be a part of that discussion? And I absolutely understand the issues associated with a nation such as the United States that has a certain number of nuclear weapons which it's bound to by treaty, but has a number of potential adversaries in the nuclear space. So I think that's a particular difficult problem, but not being a nuclear-armed nation, not one which I can answer.
Let me run down the line with that one. Do you have any thoughts on it, Melanie, from an arms control? I know that's not your area of expertise, but you are a wise woman and you've been studying this area for a while.
Well, some of the most interesting innovations that I'm hearing about lately are the ability to differentiate between different types of weapons. So, for example, I understand that we can now differentiate between whether a missile is nuclear armed or not. And so my hope is that as we have more in-depth technology innovation so that we can narrow down different categories of weapons, that might offer ways to bring China on board to maybe have different categories of arms control that target specific types of weaponry.
Okay. John?
Arms control treaties are a good thing. When the Russians roll into a port of entry, either on the east or the west coast of the United States, and they declare that they want to see Whiteman Air Force Base as an example, they roll up with their team, we take them out to a dock, they get to inspect a B-2, parts of a B-2, they get to see the weapons, either loaded or unloaded, and it provides them some assurance that the numbers and stuff is correct and in order. Guess what? That's a positive thing for the Russian perspective. When we get to do that, and we get to do that in Russia, and we talk about going, I think it was earlier today, going to new and different places. in Russia. We get to do the same thing. That's a stabilizing force. But in any arms control treaty, it takes a minimum of 2 to tango. And if your partner in that dance is not willing to abide by the rules, it can lead to ineffectiveness. In terms of multipolar treaties or multinational members, signatories, I think it ultimately comes down to do you have an enforceable rules of the road to make sure that the treaty is getting at the heart of what you're trying to do and what you're trying to illuminate. So treaties are good. Verifiable treaties that are abided by are even better. And I think, Dr. Hart, in terms of the technology piece, I think there's a lot of great technology out there today that can certainly help us with this problem. So I think it's a good point.
So General Kim, you're tangling with this in your dialogue with the North. What is the value of arms control discussions in your region?
Right now, between the North and South is interested in dealing with operational arms control. Actually, last year we had September 9th military agreement, comprehensive military agreement. But there are much pros and cons regarding this agreement between South Korean people, because I think in terms of operational arms control, credibility is very important to maintain arms control. But it is not easy for us to persuade, especially conservative people. That's why I think strategic communication is very important to maintain operational arms control. So especially in case of thinking about arms control, we focus on structural arms control, but I think operational arms control is very important.
Thank you. And I want to thank the audience. I came here with a number of questions in case we didn't get any kind of lively questions out of the audience, and I had to force my question into the deck because you guys asked some really, really good questions. I do want to thank the panel, and we asked them to get after a pretty difficult problem, which was the multipolar world. And we all know that, bipolar world, at least we kind of understand the variables. When you get into some regional areas, it gets tougher, but this multipolar world really is a much more complex problem. So I appreciate your willingness to dive on these and try to help us solve our way through here. You've given us a lot to think about. Dr. Hart, in your opening comments, you gave us some 5 things that if we could just move forward, we could actually achieve an advantage here, and that should be a warning to us all and a charge to us all. So if you'll all join me and thank our panelists for this lively discussion. Thank you. That was fun.
All right, thank you, General Whelan.